The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial begins in silence. Fluorescent lights hum their mechanical prayer above the emergency department, casting everything in that peculiar shade of white that makes 2 in the morning feel like the middle of nowhere. Brooke Sullivan pushes through the double doors at 18:47 hours, her name badge already clipped to the left side of her scrubs, positioned at exactly the same angle it was yesterday and the day before. No one notices her arrive. No one ever does. She moves through the trauma bay like water finding cracks, invisible in the way only the perpetually competent can be. The ER erupts around her, a 42-year-old male with acute coronary syndrome, chest pain radiating into his left arm, the telemetry monitor screaming its warning in 3-beat intervals. Dr. Sterling stands near the central station, already on his phone, already performing for the residents gathered around him like disciples. His voice carries the particular timbre of a man who has never once doubted his own authority. "Get me a 12 lead. Now," he commands, not looking at anyone in particular. A second-year resident freezes. Sterling's eyes narrow. The entire bay feels the temperature drop. Brooke walks past without breaking stride. She's already pulling the EKG machine from the supply room, wheels rolling silent against tile, her hands moving in the kind of sequence that doesn't require thought anymore. Muscle memory. 12 years of it. 3 combat tours before that. She sets up the leads with the kind of efficiency that comes from having done this in field hospitals where electricity ran on generators and blood wouldn't wash out of your boots. The needle goes in on the first stick. No hesitation. No wasted motion. The machine prints the readout in crisp black lines across white paper, and she slides it into Sterling's waiting hand without a word. He glances at it. Then at her. For exactly 1 second, his expression shifts, something flickers behind his eyes, a question mark where his certainty usually lives. She's already turned away, already moving to the next task, already forgotten. He'll spend the rest of the shift trying to remember why he found her presence unsettling, and by morning he won't be able to articulate it at all. The thing about being invisible is that it teaches you to see everything. By 23:40 hours, the noise settles into the peculiar rhythm of a hospital between crises. The acute coronary syndrome patient is stabilized in ICU. The waiting room empties. The ER nurses slip into that half-aware state that comes from knowing that chaos will return but not knowing when. Brooke refills the automatic blood pressure cuff in bed 7, the one she'd been assigned 2 hours ago when the patient arrived, agitated and combative. Colonel Marcus Hendricks. 47 years old. Active duty Green Beret out of Fort Carson. Admitted with altered mental status and elevated cortisol levels that wouldn't make sense to anyone who hasn't seen what untreated combat stress looks like when it boils over. The initial workup came back clean, no head injury, no obvious infection, no metabolic derangement that would explain the way he keeps muttering about Marja. The way his eyes dart toward corners. The way his hands clench and unclench like he's still gripping something that isn't there. Marja. Helmand Province. 2010, Sanjin Valley Operations. The name carries weight for people who know what to listen for. She adjusts his water pitcher with her left hand, checking the fall line with her right. The colonel's forearm is exposed, his sleeve pushed up during vitals, revealing a tattoo in faded black ink, Nomad. Block letters. Clean lines. The kind of call sign that gets carved into skin when you've earned it through things that don't get talked about at dinner tables. She doesn't stare. She doesn't acknowledge it. She simply takes in the information the way she takes in oxygen, automatic, necessary, unremarkable. The colonel sleeps now, finally, the sedation Sterling ordered working its chemical magic. His breathing is regular. His monitor shows nothing alarming. But his eyes move beneath closed lids, and his jaw works as if grinding through conversations only he can hear. The medication fog has stolen his memory of faces. That much is obvious. That much is always obvious to someone who's spent 18 years learning to read what people don't say. Brooke turns away and moves toward the supply closet near the back entrance, the one with the flickering fluorescent light that maintenance keeps forgetting to replace. Her jacket hangs on the hook exactly where she left it when she clocked in. The material is worn at the elbows. The zipper catches sometimes. It's from a department store in 2008, purchased with a credit card registered under a name that doesn't exist anymore. She reaches inside the lining where she stitched a small pocket into the fabric 8 years ago, before she became invisible, before she became a nurse, before she decided that staying alive meant learning to be forgettable. Her fingers find the faded patch. It's small enough to fit in her palm. The emblem shows a trident crossed with a rifle. Below it, 3 words stitched in thread that's starting to fray: SEAL Team 3. She touches it once. Not for courage. Not for comfort. Just for confirmation that it's still there. That she's still here. That the version of herself that lived before this version, the version that carried wounded men through minefields outside Marja while rounds cracked past her ear, isn't completely erased. The sound of voices pulls her back. She closes her fist around the patch, releases it, and closes the lining back into place. Her jacket hangs exactly as it did before. No one will ever know it's anything other than fabric and stitching. The doors to the ER open on a whoosh of cold air from outside, and Dr. Sterling strides through like a man who's just remembered he's the one in charge. Behind him walk 3 people in business casual, the kind of expensive fabric that doesn't wrinkle, the kind of watch that costs more than Brooke's truck. Board members. The hospital's financial architects. The people who installed Sterling into his position 3 years ago, the people whose phone calls he takes at dinner, the people who own the air he breathes. Gentlemen, Sterling says, his voice climbing half an octave. He's performing now. The entire ER feels it. He gestures toward the main bay with the kind of proprietary sweep that includes himself in the gesture. I just stabilized another MI case. First stick EKG. Straight to cath lab. That's what I call efficiency. One of the board members, the one with silver hair and a Rolex that catches the light like a weapon, nods approvingly. That's the standard we need to maintain, Sterling. That's why we brought you here. The words hang in the air like a benediction. Brooke continues charting at the desk nearest to bed 4, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision, her presence so thoroughly unremarkable that she's already become part of the architecture. The hospital's ghost in scrubs. The one who doesn't ask for recognition. The one who doesn't network. The one who kept her head down for exactly long enough that everyone forgot to ask who she was. Sterling leads the board members toward the physician's lounge, their voices fading into the kind of laughter that comes from people who've never had to doubt their place in the world. One of them mentions his brother-in-law who just made partner at a law firm. Another references a property investment portfolio. The third talks about his daughter's acceptance to an Ivy League school, the kind of casual certainty that assumes doors will always open for people like them. The ER settles back into its half-sleep. Brooke finishes her charting. She moves to bed 7 to check the colonel's vitals one more time. Our blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 62, oxygen saturation 98% on room air. All within normal limits. All exactly as expected. His eyes are closed. His breathing is steady. The tattoo on his forearm reads Nomad, and somewhere in the medication fog that's wrapped around his consciousness, he has no idea who she is. He has no memory of a woman with hands steady as surgical steel, moving through hellfire with the kind of precision that only comes from having trained for it, having lived it, having survived it. He doesn't remember her pulling him and 2 other wounded toward the compound while rounds kicked up dust around them, while she talked other unit members through tourniquets and pressure dressings and the 1,000 small decisions that kept people alive when they should have died. That was a different life. That was a different woman. That was someone else entirely. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is that Dr. Sterling would walk past that bed 10,000 times and never once understand what he was looking at. He would see a soldier. Brooke would continue to see a mission. And in the space between those 2 understandings, everything that was about to happen would move into position like pieces on a board that no one else could see yet. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. And at Oak Creek Memorial, At 0247 hours on a Tuesday morning in Denver, a nurse named Brooke Sullivan made a note in the colonel's chart and prepared for the night shift to continue in its ordinary, unremarkable way, because she had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The colonel's daughter arrived at 0311 hours with red-rimmed eyes and a cardigan buttoned wrong. Her name was Sarah, and she'd been driving for 4 hours straight after the call, the kind of call that erases everything else in the world. She stood at his bedside trying to reach him, her voice soft and breaking. "Dad, it's me. It's Sarah. Can you hear me?" But her father wasn't reaching back. He was pulling at his fore, his movements jerky and purposeful, his eyes tracking something none of them could see. "I have to get back. They need me. Where's my rifle?" The monitors beeped their steady indictment, heart rate elevated, respiration shallow, oxygen saturation hanging at 92%. He wasn't agitated. He was lost. Brooke had been watching the colonel's pattern for 3 hours. The benzodiazepines they'd pushed during intake were still in his system, clouding cognition, and the fluorescent lights above his bed cast everything in a sickly yellow that made disorientation worse, not better. She'd seen this 100 times in recovery wards, ICU delirium in post-operative patients, confusion compounded by drugs and unfamiliar surroundings and the simple terror of not knowing where you were. The colonel kept saying things about Marja, kept asking for his unit, kept trying to climb out of bed like his body was operating on muscle memory from 20 years ago. It wasn't madness. It was physiology. It was temporary. It could be fixed without chemicals. Dr. Sterling arrived at 0318 hours with 2 board members trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. He'd been in the administrative wing reviewing metrics with his allies, 3 phone calls, 2 confirmations that his trajectory upward was still on track, 1 reminder that the board valued decisive leadership above all else. He saw the colonel thrashing, saw the daughter's tears, saw an opportunity to demonstrate control. His white coat moved like water as he approached the bed, his voice already pitched for an audience. "He's escalating. Needs chemical containment. Not assessment. Not questions." Commands issued like he'd already looked inside the patient's skull and found only chaos. Brooke stepped forward, her voice quiet enough not to carry past the curtain, professional, measured, the voice of someone who'd learned long ago that volume and authority were inversely related. Dr. Sterling, respectfully, is displaying classic symptoms of ICU delirium exacerbated by benzodiazepines. His O2 sat is dropping because he's panicking, not because he's medically unstable. If we reduce the Ativan and reorient him instead of restraining him, we might see him clear in the next hour or 2. Her hands were steady as she spoke. Not a tremor. Not a plea. Just information delivered to someone who'd already decided not to listen. Sterling's smile sharpened like a blade finding a whetstone. He turned to face her directly, and the board members exchanged glances. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment when the hierarchy reasserted itself. His voice climbed 3 octaves and carried down the hallway past the curtain where 3 nurses froze mid-step, coffee cups suspended halfway to their mouths. Nurse Sullivan seems to think her 2-year degree from some community college trumps my MD from Hopkins. The colonel needs chemical sedation, not a feelings chat. Maybe stick to emptying bedpans. The silence that followed had weight. It had texture. It had the quality of a room holding its breath. Sarah stared at Brooke with something like confusion in her eyes. This thin woman in scrubs had just been questioned in front of her, corrected, diminished. But Brooke's jaw moved once, twice, then stilled. She took one measured breath that filled her entire thorax, held it for exactly 3 seconds, and released it through her nose. The tears came only after she looked away, a single tear tracking down her cheek while her eyes remained fixed on the monitor screen above the colonel's bed. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, had taken on the texture of someone speaking from a place deeper than anger. "The colonel has a name, Doctor. Maybe try using it." She said it to the monitor. She said it so only Sarah and Sterling heard it. Then she turned and began documenting the interaction in the chart with handwriting that didn't waver. Sterling ordered the restraints anyway. For point, leather cuffs, the kind that left marks. He ordered 5 milligrams midazolam for push despite Brooke's quiet documentation of her objection in the electronic record. Within 20 minutes, the colonel was sedated into silence, his thrashing replaced by the shallow breathing of a man chemically suppressed, his confused calls for his unit replaced by the steady beeping of monitors telling the story of what happens when fear gets medicated instead of treated. Sarah sat beside him crying quietly, her hand on his sedated palm, and Brooke continued her rounds with a kind of mechanical precision that comes from having nothing left to feel. 2 hours later, at 0537 hours, she went to the break room to eat the sandwich she'd packed at home. The lights flickered. The coffee maker gurgled. She sat down with her lunch at the corner table that nobody else ever chose, and within seconds the room emptied like she'd announced a hazmat breach. 6 staff members suddenly remembered urgent tasks, charting that needed doing, supplies that needed restocking, phone calls that couldn't wait another 7 minutes. One nurse abandoned her half-eaten yogurt on the table. Another left her badge on the counter. The room went from full to empty in the time it took Brooke to unwrap her sandwich. She ate alone under lights that buzzed with the electrical hum of failing tubes. Her phone stayed dark. Nobody texted. Nobody sat with her. This was how it worked when you challenged the hierarchy, not with words, not with confrontation, but with the simple erasure of your presence from shared spaces. The break room was yours until you tried to think for yourself, and then it belonged to everyone else and you belonged to the silence. By 07:15 hours, when the day shift arrived for their 0730 briefing, there was a formal write-up posted on the unit board where everyone did shift change. The paper was laminated, official-looking, her name printed in bold letters at the top. Insubordination and overstepping scope of practice read the header. The body of the write-up cited her inappropriate challenge to physician orders, her unsupported medical opinions, and her disruptive behavior detrimental to unit morale. Sterling's signature was prominent at the bottom, dated and timed. He stood 20 feet away with his coffee, watching her read it, and when she looked up he smiled, the kind of smile a man makes when he's just moved a chess piece across the board and removed something from the game. The day shift crowded around the write-up like it was a work of public art. Brooke could feel their eyes shifting toward her, could sense the calculation happening in their heads. Sterling had resources. Sterling had allies. Sterling had institutional power that moved like gravity, bending everything in the hospital toward his center. She was a nurse with a 2-year degree. She was someone who challenged orders. She was someone who'd just been officially documented as a problem. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 nights later, at 2,243 hours, when the evening shift was changing to nights and the security desk was temporarily unmanned and the hallways were in that brief moment of chaos where nobody could tell who belonged there and who didn't, a man in a dark hoodie moved through Oak Creek Memorial like he'd walked these corridors 1,000 times before. He knew exactly which hallway. He knew exactly which room. Surveillance footage later showed him moving with the precision of someone who'd been briefed, who'd studied the layout, who knew that at 2,247 hours the colonel would be lightly sedated but conscious, and that Dr. Sterling would be somewhere in the administrative wing texting his board members about ways to get Brooke Sullivan permanently removed from the schedule. Brooke was restocking the crash cart on the colonel's floor when she saw the man. She didn't see his face, the hoodie obscured everything. What she saw was the movement. The way his hand emerged from his pocket. The way 6 inches of steel caught the light from the hallway exit sign. The way his body coiled to move through the colonel's doorway. Sterling was 20 feet away. He saw it happening. His brain processed the images but his body didn't move fast enough. Doctors who'd been trained in controlled environments froze when chaos arrived in real time. Brooke didn't freeze. She moved like her body was operating on code written somewhere deeper than conscious thought. She stepped directly into the doorway, directly into the trajectory of the blade, and felt the knife punch through muscle and tissue and find the space between her ribs. The pain was white-hot and immediate, a sensation so bright it erased everything else in the world. Blood soaked through her scrubs in seconds, a dark stain that bloomed like a flower opening. Her hands did what they'd been trained to do in places that no longer officially existed on any map. She trapped his wrist. Rotated her hip. used his momentum to slam him into the doorframe with a precision that would have made her instructors nod with approval. The attacker's body went slack. His hand opened. The knife fell. Security tackled him while he was still dazed. Radios erupted. The alarm on the colonel's monitor screamed, not arrhythmia, something worse. Tension pneumothorax. Right side. His trachea was deviating left, his lungs collapsing under pressure that shouldn't exist. Brooke pulled gauze from her pocket, muscle memory, always carried trauma supplies, and pressed it hard against her own wound. Her vision was starting to tunnel. Her lungs weren't filling right. But her voice was steady as she talked the code team through what needed to happen: 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Push hard. Listen for the hiss of air escaping. Don't wait for confirmation. A young resident hesitated. Brooke's voice dropped another octave. Do it now. The needle went in. The hiss came. The colonel's oxygen saturation started climbing: 82, 87, 91, 95. Sinus rhythm returned to his monitor. Then Brooke's legs stopped working, and the floor came up to meet her, and everything after that belonged to someone else's story, except it didn't, not really, because nothing would ever be the same again. 3 nights later, the security desk sat empty. Shift change chaos, paramedics arriving with a drunk driver, 2 uniforms escorting a psych hold, visitors flooding the corridors. In that 4-minute window when nobody was watching the metal detectors, a man in a dark hoodie slipped past the entrance like smoke moving through a room. He didn't hurry. He didn't look left or right. He simply knew where he was going. The colonel's room was on the 4th floor, north wing, 3rd door past the nurse's station. Room for 47. 20 feet down the hallway, Dr. Sterling stood absorbed in his phone, reading something that made his jaw tighten. A text from one of his board members, confirmation that Brooke's nursing school had no record of her graduation. Another message marked urgent, flagged in red. He was still reading when the hoodie passed him without acknowledgement. Sterling didn't look up. Brooke was in the medication room when the monitor alarm didn't sound. That was the first wrong thing. Oak Creek Memorial's ICU monitors were programmed to alert at every room entrance, a safety protocol Sterling had complained about during his first week. Too noisy, he'd said. The response time had been adjusted. Reduce sensitivity. Faster patient flow. Now that same adjustment meant nobody heard the room door open. She knew something was wrong the instant her hand stopped moving. Medication lock clicked secure, for bags hanging balanced and cold under the fluorescent glow, and then nothing. The absence of sound. No monitor chime. No ventilator hum. Just the rush of air through the corridor's overworked vac system, that mechanical wheeze that never stopped, never paused, never registered until it was all you could hear. Brooke moved. No decision, no pause, just the simple shift from standing to walking that happens before the conscious mind catches up. Muscle memory recognizes threats the way a dog recognizes a whistle, before language, before thought, pure animal knowledge transmitted through 12 years of training in places where hesitation measured in fractions of a second meant death. The hoodie was raising his arm when she stepped into the doorway. The knife caught light. Stainless steel, 8-inch blade, the kind bought at a camping store for $40 and sharpened on a concrete curb. The arm was moving with the confident speed of someone who'd practiced this gesture, who believed in its inevitability. The colonel was still sedated, still monitored by machines that weren't watching, still helpless on the bed below. Brooke's body was already responding before her brain registered the choice. She didn't think about the blade or the trajectory or the 17 stitches she'd receive in 3 hours. She stepped into the space where the knife was traveling, intercepted it with her ribs and shoulder instead of letting it find the colonel's chest, and in that same motion, the motion that took less than a second, her hands moved to the attacker's wrist with the practiced precision of someone who'd learned knife disarms from instructors the Pentagon doesn't list in any public database. The blade caught her across the ribs first. Hot. Immediate. Like being struck by something alive and angry. Then the shoulder, the knife sliding across bone as she twisted the man's arm using his own momentum against him, using the weight distribution of someone who weighed 40 pounds more than her but was for seconds slow on recognizing he'd already lost. He hit the floor with his arm still extended, with Brooke's hand still controlling the knife hand, with her left leg still intact and her right knee already driven into his sternum, not to hurt him but to pin him, to keep him pinned until help arrived, to ensure the colonel stayed alive. The blade clattered across tile. Someone was screaming somewhere down the hallway. A code button was being pressed. Footsteps converged like waves toward the room's open door. Brooke's eyes were clear. Not shocked. Not panicked. Just taking inventory the way someone assesses a patient's status during triage. Bleeding, yes, 2 separate wounds. The rib wound the concern, possible pneumothorax if the blade penetrated the pleural space. Pain was data. Data was survival. She reached for the sterile gauze pack mounted on the colonel's bedside, tore it open with her teeth, and pressed the compress against her ribs hard enough to stop the immediate bleeding. The resident who burst through the doorway was named Patterson, third-year emergency medicine, strong hands and faster reflexes than average but frozen now, staring at Brooke standing over a restrained attacker with blood soaking through her scrubs and her voice steady as a metronome. Second intercostal space, Brooke said. Not a request. Midclavicular line. He's got a tension pneumothorax building. Do you know where that is, or do I need to show you? Patterson's hand shook. They moved toward the colonel's exposed chest, seeking the landmarks. Brooke's right hand shot out, not rough, just certain, and guided his palm to the correct position while her left hand kept pressure on her own wound and her breathing stayed measured, controlled, the way someone breathes when they're holding something together that's trying to fall apart. 14-gauge angiocath, Brooke said. Patterson fumbled for it, and Brooke continued without missing a beat, perpendicular to the chest wall. Push straight through until you feel the resistance give. Listen for the rush of air. That rush means you just saved his life. Patterson pushed. The needle went through skin and muscle and into the pleural space, and the sound came, that hiss of air escaping from the lung cavity under pressure, and the colonel's oxygen saturation jumped from 68% to 84% on the monitor that had just been plugged back in by a nurse who materialized from nowhere. 84, Brooke repeated, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd done this before in places where equipment failed and mortality was counted in minutes. Keep pushing. We need 90, minimum. You've got 8 minutes before cardiac arrest becomes a real probability. 8 minutes to get him stabilized, get a chest tube in place, get him to OR. The resident kept pushing. The nurse was calling for the trauma surgeon. Security was restraining the hoodie. Brooke's legs felt strange, not weak exactly, but distant, the way a limb feels when you've slept on it wrong and it wakes up confused about which direction is up. She didn't make a sound when her knees gave out. She simply collapsed backward onto the floor, her hand still pressed against her ribs, her breathing still controlled, her last conscious act to release the pressure on her wound so she could see the monitor one more time, oxygen saturation 92% and climbing, the curve of the graph line moving toward stable, moving toward survival. That was when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway. He didn't step inside. He simply stood there, absorbing the scene, the restrained attacker, the blood on the floor, the resident stabilizing a patient who was no longer actively dying, and Brooke, somehow still conscious despite the spreading crimson bloom across her shoulder, watching Sterling's face with an expression that could have been amusement if she had the energy to produce it. Sterling's hand was already moving toward his pocket. Toward his phone. Toward the calculations that were already spinning behind his eyes like a slot machine landing on jackpot. By the time Brooke was being wheeled to the OR for the laceration closure, 17 stitches across her ribs, 12 more along the shoulder where the blade had scored bone, a compression bandage that would become her uniform for the next 6 weeks, Sterling was already making calls. The first call was to Marcus Chen, board member and pharmaceutical executive, CEO of a company that had paid Sterling's tuition at Johns Hopkins in exchange for his future endorsement on clinical trials. She staged it, Sterling said, not even bothering with greetings. Think about it. Write-up gets filed. She becomes desperate. Suddenly there's a knife attack? Suddenly she's a hero? The narrative fixes itself. The second call went to James Whitmore, hospital administrator and Sterling's neighbor at the country club where Sterling's family had a membership since 1987. Her nursing credentials don't verify, Sterling said. I had someone check. The school has no record of graduation. References don't answer. Could be stolen credentials. Could be fraud. Definitely something worth investigating at the state level. By 3 a.m., an investigator from the Colorado Board of Nursing had been contacted. By 5 a.m., Sterling had submitted a formal complaint requesting a full review of every medication Brooke had ever administered, every chart she'd ever touched, every patient she'd ever cared for during her tenure at Oak Creek Memorial. The paperwork cited gaps in employment history and unverifiable credentials and patterns of suspicious behavior inconsistent with standard nursing practice. By 8 a.m., the paperwork had been stamped official. By noon, Brooke was being notified of her suspension pending investigation. She signed the letter with her non-dominant hand because her left shoulder was wrapped in enough gauze to make her look like a mummy, because her dominant arm stitches pulled when she moved, because the pain medication they'd given her in recovery was still moving through her system like fog through a canyon. The letter cited unexplained gaps in employment history and unverifiable credentials. It did not mention the colonel's survival. It did not mention that Patterson's hands had been steady because Brooke had made them steady, because she had guided him through a procedure that saved a life. It did not mention that the man on the floor was already talking about filing assault charges against the restrained attacker, that security footage would show Brooke stepping between the blade and her patient, that her body had become a barrier between death and survival. The letter simply said, "Your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is suspended pending investigation. Report in writing to HR within 48 hours. Sterling read the confirmation email with his coffee going cold beside him, watched the suspension letter distribute through the hospital's internal system, listened to the nurse's station go quiet when word spread that Brooke had been suspended for falsified credentials despite, or maybe because of, saving the colonel's life from a stabbed attacker. But that wasn't the worst part. What Sterling didn't know was that the colonel, finally lucid enough to remember his own name, was reading Brooke's file with shaking hands in a secure room somewhere that Sterling didn't have clearance to access. What Sterling didn't know was that a two-star general had already been briefed about the incident. What Sterling didn't know was that his board member allies wouldn't be taking his calls for much longer. The resident's hands trembled as he stood frozen over the colonel's chest. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the colonel's oxygen saturation had plummeted to 58%. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart. The monitors screamed their electronic warning and Brooke moved without thinking, her left shoulder already seeping blood through white gauze that had turned the color of rust. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady as concrete. "Needle decompression. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." The resident's eyes went wide. "I've never." "You have now." She placed his trembling fingers on the colonel's bare chest, guiding them to the correct location between his ribs. Her own breathing had gone shallow, but her hands didn't shake. Pain was information. Blood loss was a mathematical problem. The colonel's failing oxygen saturation was the only equation that mattered. Perpendicular to the chest wall. You'll feel the pop when you breach the pleura. Another nurse appeared with a 14-gauge angiocath needle already drawn. Brooke took it left-handed, her right arm was no longer reliable, and pressed it into the resident's palm. Her blood dripped onto the sterile field. She didn't apologize. She didn't step back. She stood there with one hand on his shoulder and counted aloud. "Insert perpendicular to the chest wall," she said, her voice like a metronome marking time. "Steady. You've got this." The needle slid in. The resident's face went pale. And then the hiss of air escaping, that sound of pressure releasing, of a lung re-expanding, of a man's heart no longer being crushed from the inside. The colonel's oxygen saturation jumped to 71. 78. 84. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered. Brooke's vision flickered at the edges. The pool of her own blood had spread across the floor, a dark mirror reflecting the overhead lights. She blinked once. took a breath, stayed vertical. The attending physician had arrived, a woman named Chen who had watched Brooke's hands move with the precision of someone who'd done this before, who'd done it under fire, who'd done it when the casualty was someone whose life she'd already carried through a minefield 2 miles long. "Get her to the OR," Chen said, pointing at Brooke without looking away from the colonel's monitor. "Someone get her a chair before she falls." Brooke sat down. The world tilted slightly. She kept her eyes on the colonel's chest, rising and falling now with the regularity of someone who was going to live. The resident was still holding the angiocath needle, staring at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger. "You did good," Brooke told him. Her voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. "You're going to be a good doctor." She made it to the OR. Made it through the repair of the stab wound across her ribs and shoulder blade, 12 stitches, the surgeon said, plus 2 more layers underneath. Made it through the blood transfusion and the vitals monitoring, and the moment she finally closed her eyes and let someone else be in charge. She didn't dream. She didn't wake screaming. She simply ceased functioning, the way a machine powered down, and when consciousness returned 4 hours later, she was in recovery with a chest drain and bandages that smelled like antiseptic and copper. The colonel was 3 rooms away. Still alive. Oxygen saturation normal. The tension pneumothorax had been relieved in time. Brooke closed her eyes and felt the small weight of the unit patch against her ribs, sewn into the lining of her jacket where it hung on the back of the chair. The only proof. The only memory she was legally allowed to keep. Within an hour, Dr. Sterling was in the administrator's office with 3 board members arrayed around a mahogany table like a tribunal. He held a cup of coffee that trembled slightly as he spoke, not from guilt, but from the adrenaline of a man who had narrowly escaped a lawsuit. "We dodged a liability nightmare," he was saying, his voice carrying the smooth certainty of someone who had never questioned his own judgment. "Imagine if we'd kept her after this. Imagine if she'd hurt someone. A nurse with that kind of violent reaction, unstable enough to stage a heroic scene just to." "You think she stabbed herself?" one of the board members asked. His name was Hastings and he controlled 2 hospital endowment funds. "I think she saw an opportunity," Sterling said, and his smile had the confidence of a man holding for aces. "A knife, a patient, a moment to become indispensable. I've seen it before in people with borderline personality profiles. The attention-seeking behavior, the rejection of normal hierarchy, and now this, physically inserting herself into a trauma situation that was perfectly under control." The second board member, whose name Brooke would never learn, leaned back in his chair. "You have evidence of this?" "Better than evidence," Sterling said. He pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice became warm, collegial, the voice of a man talking to someone who owed him something. "Hi, it's Tom Sterling. I'm calling about a nursing school reference I need to verify. One of our staff, Brooke Sullivan, claims she graduated from your program in 2019 with an associate's degree in nursing." He listened. His smile tightened slightly. "Right. And how long would it typically take to verify enrollment records?" He listened again, longer this time. "I see. And if those records don't exist?" He hung up the phone and set it on the table like it was a trump card. "The school has no record of her ever attending. None. She falsified her credentials to get hired at this hospital." The room had gone the way of controlled silence. The kind of silence that precedes lawsuits being withdrawn and complaints being buried. Sterling made 3 more calls that afternoon. One to a private investigator he'd used before, a woman named Carlisle who specialized in background checks that went deeper than background checks, who asked the questions that didn't belong in normal conversation. "I need you to pull every chart she's touched in the past 3 years, he told her. "Look for prescription errors, medication inconsistencies, anything that suggests a pattern of deviation from protocol. I'm not saying she did anything wrong. I'm saying her credentials are fraudulent and I need to know what else might be wrong." He called his senator uncle and confirmed the lunch reservation for the following week. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. The incident with the nurse was already being handled, professionally and quietly, without causing waves that might reach the news cycle or the state medical board. By day 2, the formal investigation had officially begun. The outside investigator, a man named Kessler with the demeanor of someone who had never found anyone innocent, was pulling Brooke's entire file from the hospital system. 3 years of night shifts. 3 years of never calling in sick, never requesting time off, never asking for a better assignment or a promotion or recognition of any kind. 3 years of charts with no medication errors, no protocol violations, no documentation problems whatsoever. Which was, in its own way, suspicious. Too clean, Kessler told Sterling on the phone. Someone who's lived that long without a single variance in performance, either she's a machine, or she's hiding something. What about her employment history before Oak Creek? Sterling asked. He was in his apartment now, the city lights of Denver spread out below him like a map of his conquest. That's where it gets interesting, Kessler said. There's a gap. 18 months, roughly, where she has no verifiable employment, no address listed with the state, nothing. It's like she didn't exist for a year and a half. Sterling smiled. Get me her social security records. Get me her tax returns. I want to know every detail of this gap. That might take a few days, depending on how cooperative the state is being. Get it done, Sterling said. And Kessler? When you find the inconsistencies, document everything. I want this airtight before we move to termination. He hung up and looked out at the city again. He was 38 years old. Hopkins Medical School on his resume. A senator for an uncle. Board members who called him by his first name. And somewhere in this city was a fraud with a knife wound and a false identity who had tried to make him look foolish. By day 5, the suspension letter had been drafted, reviewed by legal, and officially delivered. Brooke Sullivan is suspended from employment at Oak Creek Memorial pending investigation into falsified credentials and verification of nursing certification. Said employee is not to return to the premises during the suspension period and must surrender all hospital identification and access cards. The security guard who handed her the letter couldn't make eye contact. She packed her locker in silence. The cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" from a Secret Santa 3 years ago that nobody had owned up to. The dying succulent on the shelf, leaves brown and papery from months of being forgotten. A photograph she kept face down, the kind of photograph that wasn't supposed to exist outside of classified databases, 12 faces in desert fatigues, standing in front of a Chinook helicopter with the Hindu Kush Mountains bleeding pink in the background. She turned it over just long enough to count 12 faces. For still alive. She slid the photograph inside her jacket against the lining where the faded unit patch was sewn. The only proof. The only memory. The rain started as she walked out the employee entrance, and it was heavy, the kind of rain that belonged to September in Denver, cold and relentless, the sky the color of old smoke. She sat at the bus stop 2 blocks away with the cardboard box in her lap slowly disintegrating, water seeping through the bottom, dissolving the craft paper into pulp. The photograph slipped slightly against her ribs. The unit patch pressed against her skin like a brand. The rain turned the cardboard to mush and Brooke Sullivan didn't cry. She took one measured breath. She was a senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy. She had survived a minefield. She had survived the Pentagon's decision to erase her from official existence. She would survive this. She would survive because survival was the one skill she had perfected beyond all others. The rain kept coming. Denver rain, cold and relentless, hammering the metal bus shelter like accusation. Brooke Sullivan sat on the bench with a cardboard box collapsing on her lap, watching the water dissolve the bottom corners into papery mush. Her ribs still sang when she breathed, 8 stitches across the right side, for more anchoring her shoulder where the blade had gone in at an angle that would have killed most people. She'd held her hand steady through the entire procedure. She'd talked a resident through saving the colonel's life while her own blood soaked through 2 surgical drapes. Now she was suspended. The letter was in the box. She'd read it 17 times. Not that she needed to. The words had burned into her memory at the hospital when they handed it to her with the plastic bag containing her locker, a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded lettering, a dying succulent she'd kept on the break room shelf for 3 years, and a photograph face down in the bottom. She flipped it over now, even though the rain was starting to blur the image. 12 faces. All of them young. All of them smiling in that particular way that soldiers smile when they know the camera is lying, that nobody really wants to see what they'd seen, what they'd done, what they'd buried in the part of their brain that doesn't have a name. She could name every single one of them. Second from the left, Breaker. He'd taken shrapnel in Sanjin Valley in 2011, lost his left eye but kept his humor. Third from the right, Martinez. Married his high school girlfriend, had a daughter now, worked security at San Diego International. The big guy in the back with a scar across his jaw, that was Graves. He was dead. So was the woman next to him, Patterson. And Holloway. And Chen. Only 4 of them were still alive. She'd memorized the suspension letter too, unexplained gaps in employment history and unverifiable credentials. Pending investigation into the circumstances surrounding the incident on date. Security clearance to access patient records revoked effective immediately. Termination hearing scheduled for date. Do not enter Oak Creek Memorial premises without authorization from hospital security. Dr. Sterling had been thorough. She had to give him that much. In 48 hours, he'd contacted nursing schools that didn't have her records, because her records didn't exist, because Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had never officially gone to nursing school, had instead learned triage and wound management in places the Pentagon still wouldn't acknowledge. He'd hired an investigator to dig through employment history that had been professionally erased. He'd called board members and mentioned credibility concerns with enough vagueness that the liability became her, not him. By the time she was discharged from her own hospital, the colonel's collapse had required emergency needle decompression and she'd walked him through every step. Sterling had already filed the paperwork that would make her unemployable in Denver. The cardboard gave way. Water soaked through to her legs. Brooke stood, letting the box fall to the sidewalk, scattering the contents. The mug rolled into a gutter. The succulent landed face first in a puddle. The photograph stayed in her hands, damp but intact, and she held it the way she used to hold her rifle, like it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. She'd survived worse. That was what she kept telling herself. She'd survived Kandahar province with a perforated intestine and 36 hours of no medevac. She'd survived having her name erased. She'd survived 11 years of pretending to be smaller than she was, quieter, less dangerous. She could survive this. She would survive this. Survival was the one skill she had perfected beyond all others. That's when the Suburbans arrived. They came down the street like a formation, 2 of them, black and enormous, the kind of vehicle that doesn't announce itself, that simply owns the road. No sirens. No lights. Just the sound of tires on wet asphalt and the low rumble of engines that cost more than most people's houses. They turned left toward Oak Creek Memorial, toward the employee entrance, toward the break room where Sterling was probably still on the phone, still talking, still spinning his version of events to board members who were starting to recognize the smell of a sinking ship. Brooke watched them pass. She didn't move. She didn't call anyone. She just held the photograph and waited. 12 minutes later, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered without speaking. That was how you answered calls when you'd spent a decade in communication silence, when your voice was a weapon you'd learned to control. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. A woman's voice. Military cadence. This is General Sarah Hutchins, Special Operations Command. We need you at Oak Creek Memorial, employee entrance, now. This is not a request. Brooke hung up and started walking. The rain had stopped. That seemed important somehow, the universe making space for what was about to happen. Her ribs screamed with each step. Her shoulder burned. She didn't slow down. Pain was information. Pain told you that you were alive, that you were still capable, that the woman in the photograph with the call sign Nomad tattooed on 12 other people's forearms was about to stand up and be counted. Oak Creek Memorial looked different in the gray afternoon light, less like her workplace, more like a stage. The black Suburbans were parked at the main entrance, engines idling, and as she approached, the side doors opened. Two figures in dress blue stepped out. Actual combat boots. Actual unit insignia. An officer's cover and an enlisted insignia that meant something. They didn't move until she was 10 feet away, and then the taller one, a woman with gray at her temples and a 2-star general's insignia on her collar, gave a single nod. "Senior Chief." Brooke nodded back. Her voice didn't shake. It never did. They walked into the hospital together. General Hutchins in front, 2 armed security personnel flanking Brooke, the kind of detail you don't question. The corridors of Oak Creek Memorial went quiet the way they do when something official and dangerous is moving through them. Nurses stepped back. Orderlies pressed against walls. By the time they reached the employee break room, everyone in the hospital knew something had arrived. Sterling was inside. The board members too. 6 of them, maybe 7, their faces arranged in the comfortable self-satisfaction of men who'd never had to account for anything. Sterling saw the uniforms first. Then he saw the armed security personnel. His color started to drain somewhere around his jawline. "General Hutchins," Sterling said. He straightened his tie. A reflex. A man reasserting hierarchy in a room where hierarchy was about to be executed. "I'm not sure what." "You're not," the general said. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone who'd given 100 orders that changed people's lives. "That's the problem." She turned to Brooke. The armed personnel stepped back, creating a small circle of space that felt like reverence. General Hutchins reached over and opened Brooke's jacket, the one she'd been wearing, the one she always wore, the one with the unit patch sewn into the lining. It was barely visible, just a corner of faded fabric, the kind of thing nobody would notice unless they knew what to look for. The general placed her finger on it. "That patch came from the 1st Special Forces Group," the general said. She was speaking to the room, but her eyes were on Sterling. "It's from an operation in 2011 in Marja District, Helmand Province. An operation so classified it was buried 3 levels deep. The woman standing in front of you was the medic on that operation." Sterling's hands had started to shake. Brooke could see it from 6 feet away, the tremor in his fingers, the way he was trying to make them still by gripping the edge of the table. "She was listed as KIA," the general continued. "Killed in action. Her name was officially erased from every military database in existence, which means there are no nursing school records because she never officially attended one. There are no employment history documents because she doesn't officially exist. There is only a mission, and a woman who carried 3 wounded Green Berets out of a minefield while her own blood was soaking through her uniform." The general pulled a leather case from her jacket. She opened it like it was made of spun glass. Inside were medals. They caught the fluorescent light of the break room and seemed to glow, actual metal, actual proof, actual recognition. "Bronze Star," the general said. She held up the first one. "For combat heroism." "Bronze Star." "The second medal." "For distinguished service under fire." "Purple Heart." The third medal glinted violet and gold. "For wounds received in combat." "And a Navy Cross." She said that last one like it was a prayer. Sterling was trying to speak. His mouth was moving but nothing was coming out. One of the board members had already turned his phone face down on the table. Another was checking his watch. The third was looking at Sterling like he'd just announced he had a communicable disease. "The investigation into Dr. Sterling's conduct is now a federal matter," the general said. She wasn't even looking at him. The falsified documents, the fraudulent contacts to non-existent references, the deliberate obstruction of a federal operative, those are crimes. The handcuffs belong to Special Agent Rodriguez, who is currently in the hallway. She snapped her fingers. Not at Brooke. At Sterling. The FBI agent appeared in the doorway like she'd been waiting for that exact sound. She was carrying cuffs the way Brooke had once carried a rifle, like it was an extension of her hand, like she could use it while sleeping. Sterling tried to back away and hit the break room table. His coffee mug fell over. The brown liquid spread across the surface like territory being claimed. "Dr. Marcus Sterling," the agent said, "you're under federal arrest for obstruction of a witness in an ongoing investigation, forgery of medical documents, and filing a false report with a credentialed investigator." He was still trying to explain, still insisting it was a misunderstanding, still claiming he didn't know, couldn't have known, was just doing his job. But Brooke wasn't listening. She was looking at the general, who was looking back at her with something like respect. "Your service record is being restored," the general said. "Your discharge is being reviewed. The Navy is prepared to offer a comprehensive resolution of your case, Senior Chief." Brooke's hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. "What's the offer?" "Full back pay. Complete reinstatement. Your choice of next assignment or separation with full honors." The general paused. "And the permanent record that you served. Publicly. With decoration." The room was silent. The kind of silence that only happens when the entire structure of power in a space has just reversed itself. Sterling was being escorted out by the FBI agent. The board members were pretending they'd never met him. The break room smelled like spilled coffee and the ozone-sharp scent of authority being reasserted. Brooke looked at the photograph still in her hand, 12 faces, only 4 alive, all of them honored now. She looked at the medals in the general's case. She looked at the faces of the people in the break room, finally seeing her clearly. "I'd like to serve," she said. "If the Navy has use for a senior chief who's a little bit tired of Denver." The general smiled. It was small, but it was real. "I think we can arrange that, Senior Chief. I think we can definitely arrange that." 2 years later, Sterling was teaching CPR fundamentals at a community college in Aurora, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy named Annie, earning $17 an hour from a college that had only hired him after his licensing board finally approved his reinstatement, with restrictions. His hand still shook when he pressed down on the dummy's chest. His students didn't know he used to be a doctor at a major medical center. They didn't know he'd sabotaged a federal operative. They didn't know his name used to mean something in certain circles, before those circles decided he'd never existed at all. Across the city at the Denver Convention Center, the Pentagon was holding a ceremony. Brooke Sullivan stood on a stage in full dress uniform, the Master Chief Petty Officer rank insignia on her collar, new and gleaming, the highest enlisted rank in the Navy. Her official service photo had been restored to existence, and the photograph of her SEAL team was being projected on screens 40 feet tall. The names of the 4 who hadn't made it were read aloud. The names of the 4 who had were saluted. The audience, military personnel, government officials, families, stood as one when the Secretary of Defense handed her the Navy Cross. The colonel was there. He was in dress blues too, his nomad tattoo visible now in official photographs, finally allowed to mean something. When Brooke was dismissed from the stage, he walked to meet her halfway across it, and they stood together while the camera flashes went white. His hand found her shoulder, not a gesture of superiority, but of recognition. She was a senior chief petty officer now. She was officially restored. She was going to live as her real name, her real rank, her real self. Her daughter was in the front row wearing the Navy dress uniform of a newly accepted midshipman at the Naval Academy. When Brooke caught her eye, the girl smiled in that way that only happens when somebody finally understands their mother. All the years of waking up screaming made sense now. All the scars had names. All the reasons she flinched when anyone called her were public record. The general found her after the ceremony, in a quiet corridor with marble floors that echoed with the weight of history. "You came back," the general said. "You needed a senior chief," Brooke said. "I needed the best." The general paused. "Oak Creek Memorial called. They want you back. Better terms. A position designing trauma protocols. Sterling's gone, and the hospital is trying to rebuild its reputation. Brooke thought about the break room. The cracked mug. The cardboard box dissolving in the rain. The photograph of 12 faces that wasn't hers to carry alone anymore. "Tell them I'll think about it," she said. She did think about it. 2 weeks later, she walked into Oak Creek Memorial wearing civilian clothes. Not as an employee yet, just visiting. The staff who'd abandoned her in the break room stepped back with something like shame on their faces. The nurses who'd watched her work for 3 years without knowing what they were looking at suddenly understood. She was there to see the colonel, who was being discharged with a clean bill of health, who was walking on his own 2 legs because she disarmed a knife attack and performed emergency medicine bleeding out from stab wounds. The last thing she did before leaving was stop by the break room. It was different now. They'd repainted, replaced the furniture, tried to make it into a space that didn't carry the weight of what had happened there. She stood in the doorway for a moment, remembering the feeling of isolation, the cardboard box falling apart, the rain turning everything to nothing. Then she smiled, small, private, the smile of someone who'd survived worse and lived to walk back through the door. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story hit you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to know that quiet strength is real strength. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value? Your stories matter too.